elsker den der jingle der. Man tror, der kommer et eller andet. Man tror, det starter en boksekamp eller et eller andet, ikke? Og så er det bare Abdel i en pink jakke. Velkommen tilbage til Future Talk-scenen, hvor det er godt, der er fyldt igen. Vi skal til at tale om forskelle, kønsforskelle i hjernen. Og det skal vi med tre dygtige mennesker. Gina Rippon, der er Englands førende forsker inden for kognitiv neurovidenskab med særlig fokus på køn og kønsforskelle. Hun har skrevet en bog, der hedder Gendered Brain, som påviser, at biologien ikke spiller nogen afgørende rolle, når man taler om mandlige og kvindelige, eller det vi kalder mandlige og kvindelige hjerner. Mikkel Wallentin er lektor i kognitiv videnskab ved Aarhus Universitet, og han bruger nogle hjernescanningsteknikker til at undersøge forholdet mellem sprog og hjerne, herunder altså også om kønsforskelle. Det er noget, han har skrevet nogle artikler om. Og så bliver samtalen styret af Torben Sangild, filosof, journalist, forfatter. Han har også skrevet en række ting om det her emne, og har blandt andet skrevet artikler om psykologi og hjernen, og inklusiv en Heartland-artikel om netop Gina Rippons bog, The Gendered Brain. This talk will be held in English, so without further ado, please welcome Gina Rippon, Mikkel Wallentin, and Torben Sangild.
Okay. Hi. Everything concerning gender is controversial. Gender debates, feminism, they always create a lot of debate, angry debates on social media and so on. And you might think it would be different when we're talking the scientific field of neurology and brains. Here it should be quite clear what's going on with gender differences and similarities, but it's not. Scientists argue about these matters, and the field of thousands of studies showing different things in different ways are easy to get lost in. So one might be tempted to simply instead read a popular book with a title such as Men Are From Mars and Women Are From Venus, or Why Men Don't Listen and Women Can't Read Maps. That's an actual book title. Or you might read Gina Rippon's book, The Gendered Brain, written in opposition to what you call neurotrash. We'll talk about that later. No more exaggerations of gender differences, no more gender stereotyping. Instead, you want to look at the full picture of what neuroscience has actually discovered about gender. So if you were to sum up the most important points of your book, Gina, what would they be?
Well, it's called The Gendered Brain, and something you haven't touched on is the difference between sex in terms of the kind of biological determinants and gender in terms of what society expects. You know, we could have another 10 minutes on that. So it's really the way in which I wanted to demonstrate how big the impact of the world is on the brain, and that the earlier claims that there was two types of bodies, two types of brains, so there's male and female body, and whatever it was that in the early years they didn't know, whatever it was that determined male bodies and female bodies also determined male brains and female brains, and they were different, and that meant men and women could do different things. They could expect different things out of life, and life could expect different things out of them. And it was really to say, in the 21st century, we've got a much better idea about our brains are embedded in the world, and the world has a very big impact, much bigger than we ever realized. My interest is really how brains get to be different for whatever reason. I work in the autism world, and that is a field full of very different brains. The one thing I would say is this is not a sex difference denier's manual. The term sex difference denier has been pointed at me by critics of the book, a bit like climate change denier, presumably with the same consequences for human civilization. It's not. I genuinely believe that there is an influence of whether you're male or female, but where that comes from and how powerful that is is a matter of debate, which is why we're here.
Thank you. Mikkel, you have also read Gina's book. What is your impression of the book, sort of in more general terms? We'll go into more specific details later.
Yeah, so I've done a bit of research in the sex/gender differences in language and in how language is instantiated in the brain. So that's how I come to sit on this stage. And I read Gina's book, and so one of the biggest take-home messages in psychology and cognitive science and language research is that there's a huge amount of variability. So people are really different in how well they do things. And when you then look at how much of this variability can be explained by sex/gender in the behavior and psychology, then it's a very, very small amount. So perhaps 1 or 2% or so.
Yeah.
And bringing me back to your question, I think that when I read Gina's book, there's a lot of very, very interesting things in that book, and I agree with almost everything. There's a small portion where I then perhaps disagree, and we can then, of course, spend the rest of our 50 minutes here discussing whether that little proportion is important or not.
Okay, we'll return to the 1 or 2% later on. Gina, it's safe to say that the book has spurred some controversy. How has your life been after the publication of the book? I have sort of an idea that you're traveling around the world and defending your book.
Yes. Yes, in some formats it's been very well received, and I've had some great reviews. But I think sometimes people have read the book believing it's the Sex Difference Deniers Manual. Or actually, to be honest, I think they haven't read the book. They just read the book, the title, or the associated publicity with it, and they think that I say, for example, they say, so you think men are the same as women? And then off they go on this wonderful illustrated rant quite often. I get some interesting JPEGs.
They also call you names. What have you been called?
Well, sex difference denier is one. Feminazi is another.
Feminazi, nice one, yeah.
Yeah. Grumpy old Harridan is another as well. Just get a life kind of thing. I don't know if this will work in Danish or English. The Daily Mail, commentary in the Daily Mail said I was full of carp. If you think of that word and think perhaps that's a spelling mistake, you can just play around with it anyway. We'll see if people get it.
Okay, yeah.
But yes, it's generally... sometimes the scientific community have been disturbed by some of the comments I've made as well, which is challenging.
The life of a female neurologist has been portrayed in a movie called The Female Brain. And I'm quite sure this is an accurate portrait of your working life, Gina. Let's see the clip.
After years of research, we discovered the male and female brain is wired very differently. To him, I'm basically a blow-up doll.
Oh my God, that is what you look like. Thank you.
We know that grooming releases endorphins in the female brain.
Let's not forget the Christmas present I gave you for the Brazilian straightening.
I like my hair. It looked like Bo Duke from the Dukes of Hazzard.
I don't even know who that is.
Or maybe it was my American accent. You mean, you don't know the Dukes of Hazzard?
The area responsible for defending your turf is larger in the male brain.
I'm a physical marvel.
Oh, okay.
Try me. Throw something at me. Anything. Oh. Okay. So I wasn't ready for that.
Women are also more likely to recognize flaws.
What the hell are you wearing? I threw that thing out like 3 years ago.
But I take out the trash, so now it's back live in effect.
Women want to be MMA fighters, but they still want us to hold the door open for them. These gender roles, they've been in us for 20,000 years.
Let's not do that anymore.
Oh my God.
How's it look? You like this look? How's it feel to be dating a magician?
Relationships take work.
You want me to work 2 jobs?
Why don't we take the drug, Molly?
Is that the one that make you eat people's faces off?
we turn some music on?
There's no music on?
Okay, yeah.
You let go.
On 3, let go. 1, 2, 3.
I know you wouldn't let go. That's the...
Knowing your brain makes life so much easier. Even though people can be complicated, nobody can deny our ability to get back up.
You just said 9 times.
Yeah.
Can I tell you something?
Yeah, sure.
I think you're a physical marvel.
I see, and she throws jelly. Jelly's not really something you catch. Jelly's something you eat. Yeah, of course
here we go.
ready.
Those were 2 peppers in a bag.
It was like catching nunchucks.
Right.
So, Gina, you chose this clip.
No, I didn't. Certainly not.
Is this a day in the life of
Just
Gina
like
Rippon?
you were in my lab. Yeah. Okay.
This is based on a best-selling book with the same title by Luan Brissendine or something like that. The book is from 2007. The movie is from 2017. Is this a good example of neurotrash?
This is the best, most wonderful example of neurotrash.
Could you expand on that?
The term neurotrash really refers to the idea very early on when brain imaging arrived. All of a sudden, having made devised lots of theories about the brain before we could even see the brain other than when it was dead or damaged. Once brain imaging arrived and we had these wonderful images, it looked as though we could revisit all the old questions that people had made assumptions about representation of language in the brain, etc. But there was an unfortunate side effect of these wonderful images, and that people believed this was exactly real-time imaging, that you could really see what people were thinking, how they were going to respond to what was going on in the outside world. And these images got hijacked by books like this, and hugely misinterpreting, misunderstanding, misrepresenting, linking it to kind of rather weird evolutionary theories as well. I think this film does also have us all hunter-gathering, etc. And these books became very popular because, again, they told a wonderfully compelling story. People wanted to understand, why men didn't cry and women couldn't read maps or something. Why men don't iron, that's another one you missed. And I think because they really looked like they told a good story, and they also confirmed what people believed. So we have this kind of confirmation bias when people will say, yes, my little boy is different from my little girl, therefore all little boys must be different from all little girls, and now we've got the neuroscience to prove it. So I think this is a very good example. But it also, in this kind of self-fulfilling prophecy world, I think one of the impacts that the world has on a developing brain, or an adult brain even, is this belief that male brains are different from female brains. And if you get books and films like this supporting that belief, it will then enter the pressures that are put upon our brains. So yes, good example of neurotrash. Couldn't have chosen a better one myself.
Mikkel, you want to run a small experiment with the audience, and now is the time, so we need a slide here. Yes.
Yeah, so I'm sure that you've all heard a lot about, from popular media or neurotrash outlets, that there are fundamental differences between male and female brains. And now we're going to find out. So here we have a number of brains on the screen here, and I don't know if you can see them over there for me, but Torben will now take notes, and what we're going to try is a game called Wisdom of the Crowd. So there's a lot of studies in social psychology that actually suggest that a group of people work better than one. So the idea is now that we are going to take a vote for each of these brains, and so they're randomly picked images from one of my studies, and some are male brains and some are female brains. So let's see what we can do. So we start with number 2 here. And I want everybody who thinks that this is a male brain to raise their hand now. And I'm sort of an autist, so I can easily count here. Yes. Everybody who thinks that it is a female brain, raise their hand now. Yes. And that was a small advantage for the male brain, I think. So number 2 was a male brain. Are you taking notes, Torben?
It's a lot of don't knows out
I'm taking mental notes.
Okay.
I don't have a pen.
Number 3 now. We're doing the same. Everybody who thinks that this is a male brain, raise your hands now. Very few. Those who think that it's a female brain, raise your hand. So that's a clear majority for female brain. Good. Number 4. Male brain, raise your hands. Yes. I see sort of a divide. Those over here think this. Female brain, raise your hands. I think that's a small majority for male again. So male, female, male. Number 7, male brains, raise your hands.
For a long time.
Yes. 44. Female brains, raise your hands. Yes, that's 62. So small advantage for female brain. Number 8, male brain, raise your hands. 48 this time. Female brain, raise your hands now. 68, I think. Yes, so female. So we have male, female, male, female, female. Am I right? Number 9, male brain, raise your hands. Yeah, that's 82. Female brain, 61. So that's a male brain. Number 19, and they have random numbers based on the study that they did here. Number 19, male brains, raise your hands. 78. Female brain, raise your hands. Yes, 32. So that's a male brain. Number 19. 20 is male brain. Yes, female brain. Clear majority for female. And number 22 is a male brain. Or a female brain, that was 52. That's 43. So that was a male brain as well. So now I've forgotten everything. Torben, do you remember? I asked you to take notes.
Yeah, I'm trying to remember. Okay.
Okay, so now...
What do you want
Fantastic,
to do?
we have had... So,
see, this is what I love about Heartland.
So this is very professionally organized, as you can see.
Yes.
So let's have the correct answers and see if the wisdom of the crowd... So number 2, was that...
Wow. This is almost correct.
So you can see that I've
Only
color-coded...
wrong is number 19.
The only mistake is 19. So you got 8 out of 9 correct.
Now, Mikkel, now you have to explain this.
Yeah.
Yeah, so this is...
What's going on?
Very interesting. You are, I think, for the majority, not trained neuroscientists. You're not... so how is it that we can still see this? And this is the good question now. I can tell you that I did this with my students last week, and we got the same results. So it seems as though you can actually, from just looking at a brain, you can predict the gender of this person. Right. So that's a first take-home message, that there are differences in between male and female brains. You don't need a machine learning algorithm to detect this, or rather you are sort of a machine learning algorithm that has somehow been trained on this, and you can give the correct output. And now I'm sure Gina will tell us why that's the case.
No, I was going to want to ask them what made them decide it was male and female, because we don't know.
Yeah, so people point at their noses because we don't only see the brains, we also see the noses.
Yes.
And I think that that's probably a physiognomical difference between men and women, right?
I think
the
so,
size of the nose, maybe also the shape
Or
of
you
the
can
nose.
go right back to 18th century craniology when you measured the angle between the earlobe and the nose. This is clearly an audience full of 18th century craniologists.
Yeah, that's the Heartland crowd for you.
I want you all to come join my lab when I get back to the UK. Thank you.
Yeah, so
is that the
I think so. That's one of my students' comments as well, that you can use, for example, the nose perhaps to predict these images, but it could also be that you, to some extent, work on the size, because we know
the size of the brain.
The size of the brain and the head. We know that there are clear differences in brain size. So probably that's something that you can use to.
That people are picking up.
Yeah.
Yes. I mean, I think when people say, so are there any sex differences in the brain? At one level, you can say, yes, there's a very clear sex difference. On average, brains from men, and I'm using that term carefully, are 10% bigger than brains from women. And that's because men are, on average, 10% bigger than women. And they also have bigger hearts, livers, kidneys, lungs, etc. And I didn't notice in the program that there was going to be a discussion about men having bigger livers than women or men having bigger kidneys.
That's next year we'll go. What's the
So-
difference between male and female livers? Yeah.
Yeah. So, I mean, I think, and once you look at how, as an organ, and it's a very complicated organ, believe it or not, the brain, as it gets bigger, then there are scaling issues with respect to whether each of the individual parts get bigger or whether they stay much the same size and the connections between them get bigger. And there's an efficiency trade-offs. So yes, I mean, size is an issue, as often in this area of discussion. And I think what a lot of neuroscientists are doing is now arguing within each other's labs about what the best way is of correcting for size. But I would say that if you had the time and the inclination, there are thousands of studies which have been published. In one case, they do report sex differences, not necessarily in the whole size, maybe the thickness of the cortex or different parts of the brain. And then the next month, another high-prestige journal will publish another article saying, actually, yes, there were some sex differences, but not in those areas. And so I think, and Mikkel may not agree, but I don't think neuroscience as yet, has come up with a really consistent characterization of a brain, and they can reliably indicate that that is the brain from a man or that that is the brain from a woman. And it's not like, the forensic pathologists who scrabble around in skeletons, triumphantly pick up a bone and say, I know this was a 34-year-old woman who's had 3 children and arthritis or something. We are not at that stage in brain science. We may get there if we're getting, starting to get very much more nuanced techniques. But even so, even if we look at structures, and as a neuroscientist, I probably hate to confess this, we're not really sure of the relationship between structure and function. We don't know if having a bigger amygdala has a profound effect on how on your emotional behavior, or whether having a bigger hippocampus has profound effects on your memory, for example. And there are studies linking those together in quite an interesting fashion, but not in the kind of clear-cut difference which a lot of some neuroscience findings and a lot of the neurotrash findings would lead us to believe. So interesting study, which in a way sort of illustrates, I will say this, what I'm trying to say.
Mikkel, you're in neurolinguistics, and you say that there's a 99% overlap between boys and girls when it comes to language. So a tiny neglectable difference, at least among normal kids. But when you look at the children with language problems, these differences are much bigger. Can you explain that?
Well, I can't explain it, but
can you tell us about it? Expand on it.
I can definitely say that we do seem to observe these things. And this is, I suppose, where things become really complicated, and even to the extent that you might even call them paradoxical. And you could say, just to make it clear, that I would say with this example, actually what it leads you to say is that brain size doesn't really matter. And this is that the more we look into these very general numbers, we see that they're not correlated with anything. And even though there's some of this is explained, some of this size difference is explained by general size differences, it actually turns out that the correlation, so how well you can explain the size of the person's brain on the basis of the person's body size, it doesn't really fit well. And furthermore, it becomes even more paradoxical when you look at brain size as a function of development. So we know that, for example, girls' brains have their largest size when they're around 11 years old. So if you were to believe that a large brain was better for you, then you would have to believe that girls aged 11 had reached their intellectual peak. And I don't know if I heard a small giggle from down here suggesting that that may not be the case. So we simply have to give up this very, very simple-minded idea that a bigger brain means bigger performance. And of course, there's a clear, actually, gender/sex difference in this, namely that boys' brains peak in size a little bit later. But still, it unfortunately is the case that our brains, as we age, grow smaller and smaller. So there are things that simply prevent us from concluding that a big brain is necessarily good. To get back to your question.
Yes, please.
When we look at development in children, we see that girls start to speak approximately 1 month before boys. They develop their vocabulary earlier, and this is seen across many, many countries, in different cultures. So it seems to be I would say, almost universal feature. This doesn't mean that boys do not learn language, of course, hopefully. They just seem to be, at least in the beginning, slightly delayed. But when you then follow this trajectory, it actually turns out that throughout life, at least to the extent that we can measure it, there is a tiny difference. So that if you draw the distributions, and again, we have to always keep in mind that there are some that are very bad at language, some that are very good at language, and that it's all a distribution, and most of us are right in the middle. If we look at the middle, then we cannot use language competences to predict sex or gender. It's just completely random distribution, but because there's this slightly shift, it means that as we go out on the tail of the distribution, you have to remember there are much fewer people out here, but suddenly a small difference means much more. So that means that the children who are diagnosed with autism, which is, we can discuss that, has something to do with language. Children who are diagnosed with language disturbances or developmental language disorders, children who are diagnosed with dyslexia, more or less all types of neurological / psychiatric disorders that have to do with language development, you see that boys outnumber girls 2 to 1.
So there are twice as many boys in that category
exactly.
as there are girls. Okay.
And I'm not pretending to have the explanation for this. It's just an observation that you can see that seems to be there. And so the paradoxical thing is that when you look at the whole distribution, so everybody in here, well, we cannot use language or the brain or other cognitive measures really to predict much, or we cannot use, should I say, gender to predict much. But when we look at the tails of this distribution, then suddenly it may matter a little bit.
Okay, Gina, do you have a comment on this?
Yes, I mean, I think a whole range, actually. I think you need to look at the question from both issues with respect to looking at brain images, for example. I still say you can't reliably predict that this is a brain from a man, this is a brain from a woman. More interestingly, I think you can't take a woman and say, I know that your brain will look like this, or you can't take a man and say, I know your brain will look like that, which I think is a good way of saying that that particular category, that distinction, that label, is not a good way of looking at these data. I think when you get to the extremes, I think that's possibly where these tiny differences that you've talked about become more crucial. And I think that's true in a whole range of areas. I think certainly language is one. And that is where understanding where the sex differences in the brain that we can find will take us is crucial, that we still concentrate on that. What worries me more is the idea that how this science is communicated. And I have used the word brains from men, brains from women deliberately, because actually one of the biggest claims about male and female brains, for example, in a book called The Essential Difference by Simon Baron-Cohen, his opening lines are, the female brain is hardwired for empathy, the male brain is hardwired for understanding systems. Very clear statement, and people, that becomes entrenched in people's consciousness as what we're talking about. Later on in the book, he does say, of course, you don't have to be a man to have a male brain. You don't have to be a female to have a female brain. And somebody who's interested in language, I think that's a really important thing to hang on to. What are we talking about here? And I think that is an important issue. It also is the idea that we're talking about hugely overlapping distributions, tiny differences, and in fact the variability within the two groups is much more interesting. And that's why understanding what's happening at the extremes is important, and not something that people have said that people like me are trying to prevent research into sex differences, putting women's health at risk, for example. This is the feminazi. Yeah, I did say earlier, you're either a critical neuroscientist or you're a methodological terrorist, depending on who's hearing what you're saying. So yes, I mean, long answer, I think those differences are important to understand, but they shouldn't be allowed to inform a general opinion, which then feeds back onto the very brains that we're looking at.
Thank you. Let's move away from statistics, because we can easily, it's very important, this thing, and the Simon Baron-Cohen book is sort of, is very important and very acknowledged and recognized, so it's important to have this critique of it. But let's move on to the plasticity of the brain. Many have heard that the brain is plastic, in Danish, plastisk, means it can be easily molded. There's an often used metaphor that the brain is a muscle, meaning the more you train certain things, the better the brain will be at doing them. So we actually actively form the brain during our life from our experiences and from our trainings in various areas. So the question is, of course, how much of our brain's functioning is shaped by experiences? I know it's a tough question, but can you sort of approach, I mean, reading your book, it seems like you want to emphasize this very much, that we have become more and more aware in recent years of how plastic the brain actually is.
Yes, I think the plasticity is part of the argument I'm making, in that the very early views, I mean, we are talking going back to the 18th, 19th century, was that there was a very, what we call essentialist, determinist view that your brain emerged, you were born with a particular kind of brain, and it went through life with some different characteristics. But effectively, when you reached early sort of maybe teens, your brain had developed as far as it was going to develop, and that was great, and that's what you then took out into the world. What we now realise is that what we saw, the kind of plasticity we saw in young children, also can be found, which is great for us and kind of understandable for educators, in adults and through into old age, and possibly lasting longer in old age than I'm obviously take an optimistic view. But the idea was that the experiences we have in the world will change the brain. And there's a great set of studies done in London by Eleanor Maguire looking at black cab drivers, taxi drivers. I don't know if any of you've been to London. You arrive at the station, black cab outside, say to, I want to go to Buckingham Palace or something. Those black cab drivers have had to go through a particular training called the knowledge, which means they have to learn 20,000 routes within 6 miles of Charing Cross in London. And they have to be able to, somebody will test them and say, like, I want you to, it's the middle of June, there's a sporting event on in Wembley, somebody gets into your cab and they want you to take them to the Houses of Parliament, how would you do it? And you have to instantly, it's an amazing feat of memory, of visuospatial memory in particular, but also currently being updated. So fantastic training, takes 3 or 4 years, 6 sometimes. And they've tracked trainee taxi drivers and shown that as they learn the knowledge, there's a particular part of the brain called the hippocampus, which increases in size. As they're driving taxi cabs around the place and being taxi drivers, they have this sort of enlarged part of the brain. But interestingly, when they retire, those parts of the brain diminish again. So a really nice image of how the brain can wax and wane with experience. And they've also looked at bus drivers, because they're saying, well, bus drivers also have to do complicated things, in London, but they're on fixed routes. They don't get any choice. So that's a really nice, good neuroscience experiment, I think, which demonstrates the plastic brain and demonstrates how what we do as we grow up, or what we don't do, importantly, and that's why I think where the gender issues can come in, what we don't do will change how our brain functions.
Mikkel?
Yes, I'm fascinated by this study as well. I spent part of my PhD in the Space and Memory Group in London. But when I look at it now, I still think that now that we're talking about gender, we have these large size differences, and we know that they don't matter. I'm just wondering whether that tiny little change in the hippocampus is actually causal, or whether it's just coincidence. And so the problem with these studies is that they're very, very hard to replicate, because there are only very few of these taxi drivers that take part in experiments, and they're all done within the same lab. So although I find this story fantastic and amazing, and I wish it be true, I just now that we're talking about sex and gender, and we see that a deciliter of brain doesn't explain anything, then when we have these
this what of brain, sorry?
A deciliter, 100 milliliters of brain tissue, which is the average difference between male and female, and we see that it doesn't explain anything. So why would a small change in the hippocampus, which is actually more of a shape change than a real size change if you look at the actual study? So this becomes very technical. I think we should.
I'm going to interrupt. I think 2 things. First of all, they did actually look at taxi drivers who failed the knowledge, so I think that's quite an interesting control. If it was just taxi drivers and just that study, we've talked about this before, I hold up my hands and say this needs replicating. But there are a whole range of other studies looking at musicians learning musical instruments and learning different musical instruments. So keyboard players using their hands asymmetrically as opposed to string players. You can probably tell I'm not a musician. Who use their hands asymmetrically, reflected in brain changes. Now, reflected in, correlated with, I will completely agree. How are we going to actually prove a causal link here? So sometimes we have to look at ways of proving that in different ways. And if it was just the taxi drivers, I'd agree. But I think there's a good enough evidence of how our brains will reflect what's going on around us, and not just experiences, also attitudes. There's the whole kind of stereotype threat type literature, which is interesting to criticise, I agree, but also to speculate as to how might we make this better and demonstrate whether it's an effect that we should throw away and isn't relevant.
We need also, time is running, we need also to address hormones, because many people in here are probably thinking, what about hormones? Isn't that sort of the key to gender difference, Gina? Rippon?
Okay. Yes, I mean, I think hormones, if you like, are the fuel which drives a lot of our behaviour. And again, very strong argument that the higher levels of testosterone that male fetuses are exposed to, which determine the genitalia, which gets them assigned to that sex when they're born. Also, in the same way as I was saying, 2 types of body, 2 types of brain, that will also organise the brain differently. And there is a very powerful lobby saying that a lot of the behaviours, the gender gaps we look at, are related to differences in hormones. There's a huge body of work when the idea that, discovering hormones and their role in behaviour was carried out on all sorts of non-human animals, where of course you can do all sorts of direct manipulation, you can change levels, you can block levels, and this fed into the brain organisation theory very powerfully. I think one of the things we need to acknowledge in the role of human hormones in behaviour is that it is now emerging with studies of social neuroendocrinology, that human hormones are as responsive to, in a way, what we've just been talking about, the environmental context as the brain. And so that's another area where maybe looking at human hormones, we need to be careful not to extrapolate too powerfully from animal studies. For example, the testosterone levels in fathers who are the primary carers of newborn babies are lower than the testosterone levels in fathers who are not the primary carers of newborn babies, human fathers, I would say. And so this is a nice example of how a social context is reflected in what people used to assume was a fairly fixed physiological characteristic.
So it goes both ways. Hormones affect our behavior, but our behavior also affects the hormone levels.
I think that the closing of the loop is really what I'm hoping that the 21st century neuroscience is doing. Very old, so people will say, oh, do you believe it's nature or do you believe it's nurture? Neither. I think what we're now seeing is that is an old dichotomy which is past its sell-by date. We need to acknowledge that the two are really closely entangled, and maybe more in human society than in non-human society. It looks as though one of the reasons we succeeded as humans was because our brains are wired to be social. We need to find out what's going on in the outside world. We need the outside world to inform us how to behave. And I think that closing of the loop and understanding how nurture is so closely entangled with nature means actually, questions like, have you got a male brain or a female brain? Could we please stop asking that question?
So this is where I fundamentally agree with Gina.
Okay.
So and probably what I've been trying to say so far has also been to provoke a little bit of a debate about the very simplistic measures that we also, Gina and I, sometimes still peddling. And I think the idea that the brain as sort of a structure where you can go and measure the size of something and then tell what it does is old-fashioned. Because it's probably the case that the methods that we have so far, and this is where this talk could be about the future, which is, I think, the title, is that we need to develop new methods that are actually sensitive to the transient changes in the brain and that are capable of actually monitoring things over time in a sensible manner. And that's very complicated, I promise you. Because the brain is so incredibly complicated in the first place, and then trying to track how it changes over time is an almost impossible endeavor. But that means that we have work to do.
Yep, excellent.
So could we say that the future of this research, the answer is not to stop entirely looking for gender differences, but to look better at these? Is that?
Yeah, I mean, that's certainly what I would say. Now that we know the different kind of variables that you could look at, like, for example, the occupation you'd have, the educational level, the hobbies you have, the sports you played, the toys you played with when you were a child. We know that those will impact in particular ways on the brain. So just asking this very simplistic binary question of all of these wonderful data that we have, huge data sets we now have, certainly the way forward is to stop asking this simplistic question. You will find sex differences if you take 1,000 brains and compare them with another 1,000 brains. But what that means and how much it should inform how people live their lives and how they bring up their children and how they're educated, I think it's really important that we get this right.
Why are people so obsessed with finding this strict difference between male and female brains? Is it because we have different bodies and we want to apply this to the brain, or is it because it's a nice story that women can't read maps and men can't multitask and all this? Do you have an idea why people want this to be a binary brain?
Well, I think we now know that being social, your social identity, self-esteem, acceptance by other people is a very powerful driver in the brain. So I think if somebody comes along and challenges certainties that you can hang on to, that you can. I mean, we're trying to predict people's behavior. Brains, that's how brains work, that's how we work. We're trying to guess, what the social nicety should be. And I think that's, that's really the issue that we need to understand, because it does provoke a lot of anger in people. And I think it's because certainties are being challenged. People will see there are gender gaps in the world. They want an explanation. And this seems like a nice, safe explanation. It's been around for a couple of 100 years. It makes good sense in terms of what was being said then. So, why do you want to come along and rock the boat and say, actually, there's more important things you should be looking at?
Well, I would also say that anybody who says that sex doesn't really interest me is probably not telling the truth. So sex obviously is a primary driver in every living species. And so therefore it's bound to be interesting for also the human species. And then how we play the sex/gender game will potentially change, but it will never go out of fashion. That's my prediction.
Could I just quickly, quickly add something? I mean, interestingly, in terms of the very angry emails that I get are generally from males or with names that make me think they're males. But actually other other emails are sometimes from women who say, our campaign is to say that women are bringing something special to the table and we're unique because we're empathic. And if somebody comes along and says, it's not actually just because you're a woman, they feel I shouldn't be telling you this because, I want you to think of me in a positive light, but I will acknowledge that is something that is the other side of the coin. Because it's a nice story, and if you're looking at inequality and said, this is a way of shifting the balance, and somebody says, actually it doesn't quite work that way, they don't like that.
We're approaching the end of this talk, and now I'm talking to the technician. I want to show the last clip now, so we're skipping the Leonard Cohen clip. We had an idea, Mikkel and I, of a Leonard Cohen song showing how deep male voices attract women and so on. That's a different story. You all know Leonard Cohen. So the last clip, please.
An ordinary dinner party, the sort of occasion we all enjoy. The men are exchanging witty stories. And look at the women, aren't they pretty? Look at the way they laugh, they're delightful. But now the conversation turns to more serious matters.
I wonder if the government should return to the gold standard.
I think it should.
Good, then we're all agreed.
But oh dear, what's this? One of the women is about to embarrass us all.
I think the government should stay off the gold standard so that the pound can reach a level that will keep our exports competitive.
The lady has foolishly attempted to join the conversation with a wild and dangerous opinion of her own. What half-baked drivel. See how the men look at her with utter contempt.
There, we're going home.
Women, know your limits. Look at the effect of education on a man and a woman's mind. Education passes into the mind of a man. See how the information is evenly and tidily stored. Now see the same thing on a woman. At first we see a similar result. But now look, still at a reasonably low level of education, her brain suddenly overloads. She cannot take in complicated information. She becomes frantically and absurdly deranged. Look at these venomous harridans. They went to university. Hard to believe they're all under 25. Yes, overeducation leads to ugliness, premature aging, and beard growth. Now let's see the proper way.
Good. So we're all agreed. We should return to the gold standard.
Oh, I don't know anything about the gold standard, I'm afraid, but I do love little kittens. They're so soft and furry.
What a delightful thought, you dear, sweet, fragile little thing. I adore you. Women, know your limits. In thought, be plain and simple, and let your natural sweetness shine through.
So, with this marvelous morale, thank you to Gina, Rippon, and Mikkel Wallentin.
Thank you.
Også tak til Torben Sangild for at styre det. Thank you guys. Well done, Gina. Mikkel Wallentin. Torben, du kan også lige få den. Godt gået alle sammen. Tak fordi I var så godt i publikum. Vi holder en lang pause nu og er tilbage 14.45 med en snak om overvågningssamfundet og overvågningskapitalisme, om vi er gået for langt. Jeg har ikke svaret. Det kan være, vi får det kl. 14.45. Giv dem lige alle tre en hånd, mens I går ud. Tak skal I have.